It's great. It's the right vibe for me. It's good.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Rhett Newman. I am the Interim Dean of the College of Education. We are so excited to have you here this evening. Just some logistics before we get started. Nearest exits are these two right here, and then out this door on your right. If you need the restroom, it's just going to be right through this middle hallway over here. With that, I am so excited that you're all here for this fantastic opportunity. As part of this opportunity, I do want to thank Tanya Lubis for being the director of the Center for Culture Responsive Practices. So thank you very much, Tanya. And I also want to throw out another congratulatory effort to the committee as well for all of your efforts that you have done to put on this amazing weekend of events. This is event number 3 that we are currently at. And so thank you so much for being here. It's going to be a fantastic hour. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tanya Lubis. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks everybody for being here. I know that we have people on live stream as well, so most of you in here that have interacted with me know that I do not need a microphone, but our folks that are on live stream do need to hear a mic. Just logistically speaking, if there are questions at the end, please wait until we bring the mic to you so that our folks can feel totally included online. And with that, I will just welcome you and say that this is brought to you in part by funding from the Educator Advancement Council of the state of Oregon. And we are just so happy to have Alex Chevron-Benet. I did it.
That was the first time since I've been here.
Benet. For a year and a half, I've been saying Benet, and then I learned it's Benet. And here from Vermont. So she is a nationally recognized author and speaker specializing in connecting theory to practice to create equity-centered trauma-informed schools and communities. She's an educator, professional learning facilitator, and writer. She believes all students need a safe and caring school environment that can be created through unconditional positive regard, recognizing the dynamic and complex lives of students. Her research and writing focuses on trauma-informed teaching, learning and systems change, social and emotional learning, building and sustaining classroom community, restorative practices, and educational equity. Alex teaches undergraduate students at Community College of Vermont in Winooski, Vermont, in-service teachers and graduate courses at Castleton Center for School and Antioch University in New England, and facilitated professional development for teachers and support schools as they implement trauma-informed practices. She's also a community facilitator for Edutopia and co-founder of Nurturing the Nurturers Collective, a healing community for educators. And I should have started with this. Her last name rhymes with Gazette. Fun fact, she loves cats, especially her tortie cat, Charlie. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alex for the next hour of our keynote on trauma-informed practices. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. Hi everyone, and hi on the live stream and the recording. It's great to be here. I'm enjoying my first trip to Oregon, although I do miss Charlie Cat. So tonight we're going to talk about unconditional positive regard and how it can foster equity and belonging and care in school. Before we start, I just want to invite you to take a moment and check in with yourself, maybe shake off your drive or your walk here, get settled, take a breath. So just take 5 seconds and feel here. And I want to invite you that as we go through the next hour, if you need to stand instead of sit, if you want to walk around while you listen, if you need to go grab a brownie or fill up your water, please feel free to at any time and just take what you need to be engaged. So my work focuses around this idea that schools as they are today are not always equitable, and they're not responsive to the traumatic world that we live in. And so creating schools that are equity-centered and trauma-informed is kind of a big project with lots of parts to it. There's many moving pieces, and in my work and my book, you can see there's lots of layers, there's many places you can start. But there's one piece of advice that if you read basically anything about equity, trauma, culturally responsive practices, restorative practices, you'll see the same thing over and over and over again. And that thing is build relationships. You'll see that everywhere. And that's good. We should build relationships. It really is the key to everything else in education. But the problem is that sometimes when I see this advice, build relationships, that's sort of it. It just says, don't forget to build relationships. It says, do a survey about what your students like, and that's sort of all that we get. And I really have come to believe that that's not nearly enough. And specifically in the context of being trauma-informed, we have to remember that relationships are not a neutral concept, right? Relationships can be healing, but relationships can also be harmful or traumatic. People experience trauma within relationships with their teachers, with their classmates, with all kinds of folks at school. And so we have to be more specific, and the way of being specific that I think is the most powerful is through a concept called unconditional positive regard. And I'm going to tell you a story of a student that I had named Kelly to sort of illustrate how this works. So this student that I worked with was at a small therapeutic school. We had very small class sizes, sometimes 8 students, sometimes 4. In this particular class, it was just me and this student, which you might be thinking sounds really great. I would love to just have one student in my class. It wasn't great, and I'll tell you why. When I would get to class with Kelly, this was my first year. I was all bright and shiny. I was like, we have this one-on-one class. I'm going to customize everything to what you want to learn. It's going to be so great. Kelly came in. She took one look at me. She called me a word which I cannot say in this room, but I'm just going to say that she called me a rat. That's not what she said. It was worse than that, but let's just say she called me a rat. So she looks at me. She says, rat. She puts in her headphones. She puts her head down on the table, and the next 75 minutes, she had her head down on the table. I was sitting with my bright and shiny survey to get to know her, and silence. So here's the thing about a one-to-one class, right? If it was a class where I had 8 students or 25 other students, we could have gotten started. We could have built some momentum. Maybe her classmate would have stepped in and helped her get moving. If it's just me and her in a room, we just sat there. And this continued. We were supposed to meet once a week. This continued for several weeks. Now, I could have gone about this in a few ways, right? If I was at a different school that wasn't concerned with therapeutically supporting students, with really holistically supporting their mental and social well-being, then maybe I would have given her a consequence for calling me a rat. Maybe I would have gotten the school director involved, and she would maybe have had, again, some more consequences, or had to go have a stern conversation with somebody. But at this school, it was really built around the idea of unconditional positive regard. And so that's how we navigated forward. And so that's what I want to share more about with you tonight. So this concept, unconditional positive regard, was originally coined by a man named Stanley Standall, and then it was later famously developed by Carl Rogers, who is a psychotherapist and developed an approach called client-centered psychotherapy, which maybe that will resonate with you thinking about student-centered learning. It's kind of the same idea, right, where you're really going off of what does my client want and need out of our therapy sessions, all of that stuff. And so when Carl Rogers originally was articulating what does this approach mean, he was sort of describing that unconditional positive regard is the stance that he would take toward his clients so that they could get the most out of that therapy experience. And here's how he described how a client would feel if they were experiencing that unconditional positive regard. A client would describe the therapist as fostering my possession of my own experience, that this is my experience and I am actually having it, thinking what I think, feeling what I feel, wanting what I want, fearing what I fear. No ifs, buts, or not reallys. Thinking what I think, feeling what I feel, wanting what I want, fearing what I fear. No ifs, buts, or not reallys. So it's really this idea that when we hold somebody in this unconditional positive regard, it's not conditional, right? There's no checklist that you have to meet to receive my positive regard, my strengths-based way of looking at you, my care for you. And it's sort of the opposite of gaslighting, right? Like if gaslighting is making somebody feel like I can't have my own perspective, I can't have my own opinion, someone is going to undermine my emotions. Unconditional positive regard is really that I'm inhabiting all of what I believe. So since the time that Carl Rogers articulated all of this, unconditional positive regard has become really foundational in the field of therapy, but then also has really transformed into education. One author who really has brought this into education as well is Alfie Kohn, who we'll hear from him later. And then I've written a great deal about unconditional positive regard recently as well. And so in my writing, I tried to define if the previous is, how the client would feel receiving unconditional positive regard. How I try to articulate it is as the teacher, what am I trying to express through unconditional positive regard? So this is the message of unconditional positive regard. I care about you, you have value, you don't have to do anything to prove it to me, and nothing will change my mind. So this sense of that care for our students, that knowledge that you inherently have value, you don't have to do something to convince me of that, I just am going to believe that right out the gate, and that no matter what you do, how you mess up, I am not going to change my mind that you are a valuable person, that you are worth being here, that you're part of the community. It sounds kind of simple, but it's very complicated to unpack. And so we're going to kind of go through 3 layers of this. We're going to talk about how unconditional positive regard is personal, so that interpersonal stance we take. We're going to talk about how it's pedagogical, so pedagogy meaning how we choose to teach. So how does unconditional positive regard come into how we do our classes? And then also looking at how it's political, so not political in the sense of how you vote, but political in the sense of systems of power and how power operates in school and outside of school. What are the elements there related to unconditional positive regard? So we're going to start at the personal level because at the core, this is very personal, right? If I am really embodying this stance, then it requires of me that I am thinking of this through all my interactions with students, right? That on a very personal level, when I am meeting with a student, I want them to know that I care about them, they have value, they don't have to prove it, and nothing will change my mind. Sometimes I literally will just say some version of this in whatever cheesy or non-cheesy way that I want to. Other times it's more about how you carry yourself, it's small interactions, it's how you show up when a student, comes late to class, right? Do you say, I can't believe you're late, go find your seat? Or do you say, hey, I'm so glad you're here, right? So it's just those little ways of communicating. But to really be able to do that, we have to sometimes unpack some of our own stuff. Because that first part of this, right, I care about you and you have value. To really do that, to really say that to a student and mean it, I have to be able to really see them. And that has to go beyond the survey of their interests, right? It has to go beyond you know, you're a student, I see the work that you do. It really has to be, I see you as a whole person. And we know that in schools, sometimes teachers don't see our students as a whole person because of bias, because of preconceived ideas we might have, because I taught your older brother, and so I'm thinking about how he was in my class when I'm working with you, because of so many reasons. So the foundation of unconditional positive regard really has to be working through all of that to truly get to know our students, to really see who they are as a whole. For me and Kelly, part of what this meant was that I had to let go of my little survey that I made because she was really not going to fill it out. And I had to really try to see how could I get to know her and really see her, and not just in that moment when she was clearly mad at me about something. Like, okay, how can I get past this a little bit? So one thing that I did was I talked with my director and some coworkers, and they helped me to reframe her behavior around the headphones and the swearing at me. One of those reframes was to think about what purpose did that serve for her. And part of what I learned about Kelly through those conversations is that she had had a lot of experiences where adults really let her down. She didn't have a great reason to trust a new person. And so by putting in her headphones, by swearing at me and like really pushing me away, she was putting up a wall to protect herself. And so seeing it in that way helped me understand that, you know, I can feel hurt by the fact that she's calling me a rat or whatever, and I can feel frustrated that she's not engaging in her work. But I can also see that what she's doing is not meant to hurt me. It's really more meant to protect her. So that's one thing I needed to do to really see her. The other thing that I needed to do was just get to know her a little better, in a way that was comfortable for her and that didn't try to come crashing through that wall, right? Because if I did that, I would be really disrespecting the fact that she's trying to put a boundary with me. So I didn't make her take the survey, I didn't ask her invasive questions. What I did instead was just sort of try to take some moments where I could. So one thing I noticed was that if I was sort of, you know, in the same space as her outside our class, she would kind of tolerate being around me. And so I would try to get next to her in the lunch line. And she would sometimes chit chat with me in the lunch line. Sometimes in the morning when we were doing kind of our morning routine at the school, you know, everybody would be in the same room kind of getting snacks or whatever. I noticed that she was really beautiful artist. She was great at drawing. And so she would let me ask her some questions about her art that she was doing. She would do these really fun characters, and so she would let me talk about that. I also talked to her other teachers and learned more about what she was interested in, what she was good at school. And so I slowly started to be able to really get a whole picture of her that I wouldn't have gotten if I just was focused on how disrespectful she was being or how shut down she was. And so really trying to get to see her as a whole person allowed me to then just feel more comfortable around her and for her to feel a little more comfortable around me. We certainly didn't have a moment where all of a sudden she went, "Thanks for believing in me and getting to know me. You're the best teacher." Like, of course not. But what she did do is that after a while, right, one headphone comes out and she'll let me talk to her a little bit, and then after a while the other headphone can come out, and then after a while I could slide the paper across to her and she would say, "This looks stupid," and then after another while I could slide it back and she would pick up her pencil, right? So it was very slow going, but really putting in that work to really see her is what allowed me to live out that unconditional positive regard. Another element of this is that we can't fully see our students if we are trying to save them. This comes up a lot in trauma-informed education because we are educators with hearts, right? We want to care about our students. We feel awful that they've experienced hard things. But sometimes that can blend over into this mode where we feel like, I'm the only one who can really rescue this kid from their hard life. I'm going to be like all those teachers that I see on TV, and I'm going to be the one who turns this kid's life around. And so then when she goes on and wins the Nobel Prize for cartoon drawing, she's going to thank me in her speech, right? Like, we get these ideas because our culture feeds those to us. But we have to let go of them if we're going to be unconditional, because if I'm looking at you through this lens of, I'm here to save you, you're not capable of saving yourself, you're so broken, I'm going to fix you, that's not really saying those elements of, I care about you and you inherently have value, right? It devalues someone when we come from this place of rescuing, because it only leaves them to be rescued. It doesn't give them any power. And so we have to really unpack some of those things in order to fully see our students. Now, I'm going to come back to this refrain throughout these levels that we're talking about, which is, this isn't easy. You know, as I'm describing all this work that I did to really try to get to know Kelly, it took a lot of time. And this was in a really small school where I had the ability to kind of seek out when she was at lunch, or we all were in the same place in the morning so I could, you know, look at what she was drawing, right? In the way that our schools are structured in most places, you don't have the time and space to do that. You have many, many students. Sometimes when we are relying on bias, it's because of expediency, because if you are a high school teacher and you have 200 students, it's really difficult to truly get to know them all deeply. That doesn't mean you can't do it. There are lots of ways that you can build relationships even with a lot of folks. But this isn't easy because of some of those logistical things, which is part of why I also talk about how this work needs to happen, changing our structures as well. But it also isn't easy because of that unpacking our own stuff, and also of trying to do that reframe I talked about, where if someone is putting up those walls, we really try to honor it instead of focusing only on the disrespect or the refusal, right? And so part of how I was able to work through this was with a team that was really committed to this stance. And so this isn't easy when you don't have that team. But even though it isn't easy, it's possible. And so I'm also going to come back to this refrain, which is, what if? You know, when I talk about unconditional positive regard, part of it is a dream, right? Like, what if this was the norm in our schools? What if we structured schools around the idea that at core, teachers need time and space to really get to know all of our students? What if we prioritize that over the efficiency of school? What if we really honored students when they were trying to set the pace of that relationship rather than plowing through those walls that they set up? And so I continually return to these wonderings and these dreamings because I want to imagine what could be possible. And so we'll return to this, and I just invite you to take a moment when you see this slide, right, to think about your own what ifs. What if this was really the way that we did school? So that core of unconditional positive regard is personal, our interpersonal relationships, but it also comes into how we teach, because it's not just about social emotional learning, it's also about academic learning and all of the learning we do in school. So in that definition I said, right, the whole thing goes, I care about you, you have value, you don't have to prove it to me, and nothing's going to change my mind. That piece of you don't have to prove it to me means that you don't have to prove your worth. But in school, we make students prove their worth quite a lot. We make them prove their worth when we rank their GPA against each other, when we focus overly on compliance and punish students who don't comply or who put up those walls. We rank their worth with grades every day, multiple times every day. We make them prove their worth through behavior when we send them to suspensions or detention. We prove students' worth through awarding some students and not awarding other students and making them compete against each other. We ask students to prove their worth through high-stakes testing. And we ask students to prove their worth through little things like PBIS rewards or pizza parties or little things that sort of teach students that you're worth celebrating only when you have accrued this many points or only when you have accomplished so much. And so all of these little things that ask students to prove their worth result in an environment where when students come to school, they don't feel that sense of freedom to simply engage in the mess of learning. Because learning is messy and it's hard, and we need to be able to fail if we're really going to go far. And to me, unconditional positive regard helps to create a spaciousness. I had a friend once who described mindfulness to me, mindfulness meditation, in this way. He was saying that, you know, a lot of people think about when you're supposed to be meditating or being mindful, you're supposed to clear your head of all your thoughts. And so he said it's like if you picture a pasture with sheep in it. Some people think that mindfulness is, you know, getting the sheep out of the pasture. But he said that actually what mindfulness is making the pasture bigger. So you're not getting rid of your worried thoughts, but you're just creating more space around them. So they're not banging up into the fences, they're not running into each other, they have a little room to roam around. I really love this to apply to unconditional positive regard as well, because to me, unconditional positive regard is like widening that pasture around our mess of learning, around the tasks of learning, around messing up and mistakes. If we feel that we have room to play and to try, and that if we fail, we're not going to be shamed or kicked out or disciplined, then it makes learning easier, right? If we know that we're not going to face embarrassment when we get something wrong, if people aren't going to laugh at us, if we're not going to have to repeat a whole course if we took a risk and then the risk didn't pan out. So when we say, I care about you, you have value, and you don't have to prove it to me, we're creating actually space for people to learn. So I mentioned that Alfie Kohn was going to come back in. He's an education writer that has some really fantastic work. I highly recommend checking out his work if you haven't. And in writing about unconditional positive regard, unconditional acceptance, he said this: unconditional acceptance is not only something all children deserve, it's also a powerfully effective way to help them become better people. It's more useful, practically speaking, than any behavior management plan could ever be. It's more useful because, again, with behavior, as with learning, if you feel like you're not going to be punished for messing up, then you can engage in that mess a little bit, right? So if Kelly felt like she was at a school where when she called me a rat, she was going to get kicked into detention, she was going to be suspended, her parents were going to be called, she was going to be lectured, then she might not have ever gotten to a place where she was comfortable enough to start letting me in, because she already would have been so harmed by all of those responses that we never would have built trust. Whereas in our school that took a much slower approach and a gentler approach, she felt like she could take all the time that she needed until she was ready. You know, it didn't rush her. Similarly, when we build communities where all students feel like they're not going to be kicked out of the community when they mess up, it means that actually we can have some healthy conflicts, right? We can speak up if something is bothering us, and we're not worried that someone is going to say, be quiet for speaking up, but instead they're going to really listen and not police us on the tone of how we said it, right? So the unconditional positive regard, when we really incorporate it into how we teach, when we think about things like using fewer grades, when we think about things like separating someone's progress from who they are as a person, when we think about creating opportunities for mistakes and honoring mistakes, we're creating that wider pasture for people to truly learn. Now, this isn't easy because, like I said, there's so many elements of school that are set up for conditional acceptance. And, you know, I'll return again to grades. I mean, simply doing something different with grading is really hard. And I say this as someone who's been trying to do something different with grading for many, many years. You're pushing against really established norms, and it's very difficult. And even if you personally can create a really unconditional classroom, your students are coming to you with however many years of not receiving that. And it can be hard to really trust a teacher who says, no, seriously, you can make mistakes here. There's a lot of unlearning that a student would have to do to really believe you. But it's possible. And I dream about what if we had a school system where there actually was no competition and that everyone was honored for their unique strengths. I wonder about what if we didn't assess learning in ways that made people feel like they were reduced to a letter or a number. I wonder about what if people felt more comfortable to really go on a wild tangent or try something out of left field so that they could try to learn something different, and when they made that mistake, they really trusted that they were going to be held by the community. So the last layer here is that unconditional positive regard is political. So as I said before, I mean this in the sense of politics as in systems of power and how people relate to each other across power differences, and how that all plays out in our policies and you know, how school is run. We don't live in a world that is built on unconditional positive regard. In fact, we live quite the opposite in our world, right? If you're talking about out in the real world, things are very conditional. How people get help, how people are treated if they mess up in society is very, very conditional. We live in a world that often throws people away based on their identity or based on the mistakes that they make. And so when we talk about unconditional positive regard, it's not just that you're going to be doing something different from other teachers, but you're literally swimming against an entire societal tide that really values being conditional. But that makes it all the more important to me, because at the end of the day, a conditional regard for students is a dehumanizing one. It's dehumanizing because it boils down a whole person, a creative, curious, wonderful child to a transaction, right? What can you produce for me in school? How can I label it? How can I put you on to the next, thing for the next year? How can we do all this in a way that isn't too disruptive? How can I put that onto a single sheet of paper to let your family know how you're doing, right? It all really dehumanizes by boiling down the really messy and complex aspects of being a person into things that are simply more efficient. That's really, when we think about being conditional, having conditions for how we accept and value people, it's dehumanizing. And so unconditional positive regard in that sense is really taking a stand against that. It's being humanizing. And this is especially important when we think about how not all students are dehumanized equally, right? We know that our school system does extra dehumanizing to students of color, to disabled students, to students of marginalized genders. And so when we say, I am going to take the time and develop unconditional positive regard for all of my students, we're really taking a stance and saying, I don't believe that how these systems are treating you is right, and I'm going to do what I can from my role to change the tide on that. I want to read you another quote from Carl Rogers, who really described this humanizing aspect, I think, very beautifully. I love this quote so much. He wrote that one of the most satisfying feelings I know, and also one of the most growth-promoting experiences for the other person, comes from appreciating the individual in the same way that I appreciate the sunset. People are just as wonderful as a sunset if I can let them be. In fact, perhaps the reason we can truly appreciate the sunset is that we cannot control it. When I look at a sunset, as I did the other evening, I don't find myself saying, soften the orange a little on the right-hand corner, put a bit more purple on the base, and use a little more pink in the cloud color. I don't do that. I don't try to control a sunset. I watch it with awe as it unfolds. I like myself best when I can appreciate my staff member, my son, my daughter, my grandchildren in the same way. I don't try to control a sunset. When I think about the politics of unconditional positive regard, I think about how often and how much energy we spend trying to control children, whether that is controlling their bodies, you have to sit crisscross applesauce in the circle, whether that's controlling what they learn and how they learn, whether it is removing the books that they want to read from the library, whether it is controlling them through the over-reliance on grades, all these things we've been talking about. Again, when we choose unconditional positive regard, we're saying, I don't want to control you. I want to see you and your value as you are. I want to appreciate you like I appreciate a sunset. When I think about my relationship with Kelly, I think about conflict as part of how I ultimately had to see that relationship through and really lean into that aspect of, I can't try to control you, I have to appreciate you, and also we're in community together. Ultimately, you know, like I said, she had been calling me a rat all these weeks. We eventually kind of worked past that and we started doing our academic work. I was finally able to really meet her where she was and do that customized learning that I wanted to. But we still had to have a little bit of conflict because by the time we built trust, then we could return to the fact that she had been calling me a rat all those weeks. And remember, it wasn't the word rat. And so we had to work through it. But by really leaning into this idea that I value you and whatever you do is not going to change my mind about your value, allowed us to have a conflict that didn't have the fear of blowing up our whole relationship, right? Because she knew that I cared about her and I wasn't going anywhere, I was going to keep showing up, I could eventually say to her, hey, you really hurt me when you called me that name. It really bothered me. This is my first year at this school and you made it really hard for me my first few weeks. I couldn't have that conversation with her in those first few weeks, but eventually we could. And I feel that we could because I had gotten to a place where that conversation wasn't about control, it wasn't about punishment, it wasn't about using my power over her to try to discipline her, but it was about two people who could see the value in each other, working through so we could be in community together. So unconditional positive regard does not mean you can do whatever you want and hurt people and let the chips fall where they may. But if we're thinking about this idea of this political level, this power level, we have to get to a place where we're not trying to control each other so that we can actually then work on being in community together. This part especially is really not easy because this challenges all of our ideas about how we do discipline in schools. It really pushes us towards things like restorative practices, which are very hard to implement in school. And it also really requires us to let go of some of the urgency we sometimes have around fixing problems in school, right? Often in school, something blows up and we feel like we have to immediately make sure there's consequences and everybody can see them, right? But sometimes we can't move at that speed because then we're, again, running through those levels of trust. We're activating a shame response that is making someone feel like they're not valued and seen and heard. And so it really requires slowing down. But it is possible. I know it's possible in part because, like I said, Kelly and I did not get to a place where I was her favorite teacher or we were best buddies or like we were in like a montage where she was getting her Nobel art drawing award, you know, whatever. It didn't happen that way. But we got to a place where we learned together, right? We worked on literacy, which is what we were supposed to be doing. And that felt like a huge win. That to me felt like someone should make a movie about that because it felt just as good. It felt good that this student who had so much fear and worry about letting herself be vulnerable enough to learn was able to be open to doing just that. That to me is the power of unconditional positive regard, and I've seen it not just with her, but with hundreds of students really being able to, once they experience being held in that regard, once they believe and can trust in that, then feeling that openness to learn, that willingness to get messy with it. And so I just dream about what if we were all communicating this? What if when a student went to school, they had the expectation that all of my teachers care about me, they believe I have value, I will never have to prove it to them, and they're not going to change my mind about that? What if that was the norm and not just something that some teachers did sometimes? So a couple of things that unconditional positive regard is not. Unconditional positive regard is not just being kind, because you can be kind to somebody but also not really think that they're valuable as a person. You can be kind but not really care about power dynamics, right? To me, unconditional positive regard, because it is such a fundamental shift from how we usually do things, really goes beyond just kindness. Like I mentioned before, unconditional positive regard does not mean that you can just do whatever you want, right? That part where I said, you have value and nothing is going to change my mind, what that doesn't mean is that you can harm whatever you want, you can be as awful as you want, and I'm never going to say anything about it, and you're never going to experience a consequence for your behavior. What it does mean is that I'm always going to separate your actions from you, right? I am never going to say you're a bad person. What we might say is you made a bad choice, or you did a bad thing, or that thing you did hurt somebody. But what I'm never going to do is say, and because of that, you're terrible. Which, like, you know, we don't say that to kids directly, but we kind of do sometimes, right? Sometimes we do make it about who they are. Sometimes you hear teachers in the teacher's lounge talking in ways that make it really clear that they're confusing somebody's choices and actions with their core value as a person. So we have to remember that unconditional positive regard doesn't mean that we're never holding people accountable, but we're always making sure to affirm that you can make mistakes, but I still value you. And I don't think that unconditional positive regard is unrealistic. I know that when I talk about it, I'm sometimes painting a picture of, you know, wouldn't this be great, and you know, all these things. But like I said, I have really seen this be very powerful in the practice of many teachers who I have worked with and whose practice I've observed, and in my own practice. And so I know that this is possible. I've worked in a school that was organized around this, so I know that it's possible at the school level. I really think that this is something that we all can work on making change around. And then part of where I want to end is also just with some questions that I still have, because as much as I believe in this, I also, like I said, right, all this is messy because people are messy, and it's a big paradigm shift. So there's still things that I wonder about. One thing I wonder about a lot is how we really hold unconditional positive regard for people who are dehumanizing others, right? Sometimes we have students whose behavior is not just disruptive, but is actively harmful or hateful because they have learned from somewhere to do that. It is really hard as an educator to hold unconditional positive regard for a student who is saying slurs at me, which has happened in part of my practice, and it was extremely difficult to work with. And so that is a challenge that comes up for me, and while I have, you know, ways that I've personally worked through it, it's something that is still an open question for me. What does that really look like? I wonder also about how we really keep justice at the center of this. Hopefully it's clear that when I'm talking about this, it's really connected again to that humanization that's pushing against injustices that dehumanize folks. I don't ever want unconditional positive regard to just become a synonym for being nice. So I really want to make sure that we're always keeping justice at the center, and sometimes I'm not sure how we do that the more that this message spreads. I wonder sometimes, how do we model this in our change-making spaces? Sometimes I witness others who are also working for equity and justice being really harsh with one another, you know, canceling each other, all these things. And I think about, if we really want to model this for students, how are we doing this with each other? And then finally, I always wonder about, how do we really rebuild schools with this as the organizing principle? I work with so many teachers who are thinking about how to use unconditional positive regard in their practice, but I really wonder sometimes about what will it take to change the structures of school. So those are things that I'm always marinating about, and would love to hear some of the things you're marinating on as well. But I want to close just with coming back to this definition and just allowing us to sit a little bit with, what this feels like and what you can imagine it would be like if schools were really built around this. I care about you, you have value, you don't have to do anything to prove it to me, and nothing is going to change my mind. It is so simple, but to me it is so revolutionary. And I hope that somewhere in tonight's talk you found a little starting point of where you might put this into practice, a question that you might think on, a conversation you might have with a colleague, or just simply a kind word that you might have for a student next time you see them. And although this isn't easy, it is possible, and we can find a place to get started. It's a big project for all of us to work on, but we can all find a place to begin. And so that's it. Thank you so much. And we have some time for questions. If you've got them, we have time for them. We have back here.
Folks, is if you can keep your questions to questions, not story hour, because we don't have a lot of time tonight. And that was not directed at you, Dave.
Are you sure it wasn't? No,
I mean, maybe.
And it's interesting, your last slide there kind of went into my question. You have your Kelly you've been working with. You're making your inroads with Kelly. But you have a group of students that have grown up in the same classroom with Kelly that know how to pull Kelly's chain, and they enjoy kind of that dynamic, that power structure. So not only are you trying to do this for Kelly, but you're also trying to address those students that are making it difficult to work with Kelly. Mm-hmm. How do you kind of work with that? And I know that kind of goes into that first question you had.
Yeah. So, a big part to me of really using unconditional positive regard is also building classrooms that are really communal and that really focus on that community. And that goes back again to the idea that when we just have that advice of build relationships, we're not always thinking about how do I build a supportive community where students aren't thinking about how do I throw someone out, how do I kick someone out. And so I actually have an essay on my website, which is unconditionallearning.org, that's titled, "What About the Other Kids in the Classroom?" Because I get a version of that question very often. And so I have an essay on there that really goes into that in some more depth, but really talks about building that community. Other questions?
So I was just curious what you're most excited about for the new book that you're working on. Like what excites you the most about that work?
I'm excited to be done with it. It's hard to write a book. So my new book is called The Process is the Point. It will come out next spring-ish. If I finish it on time. And it's really about, people often ask me, kind of related to this slide, hey, if I'm just one person and if my administration isn't on board with this, how do I actually get started on making all of this happen, on making all these ideas in your book happen? Or just in general, how do I make change for equity and justice if I'm just me? And so the book really talks about why it is so hard to make change in schools through the lens of understanding trauma. So things like, when you have a really big reaction to your principal making an announcement about a new change at the school, what's going on there? And sometimes it's a trauma response that's coming up from us. And then I really share some tools and ideas for how you can be a change maker. And so one thing I'm excited about is that there's a chapter in the book on creating a vision for change and sort of doing some dreaming. And for anyone who's going to be in my workshop tomorrow morning, we're going to do a little mini version of that. And I'm just really excited for people to be able to engage with some of those prompts and activities in there. Thank you for asking.
You talk about not having students prove themselves, and I work in a middle school, and a lot of times if students know that something's not going to be graded, or even if it is, they don't have that care. They don't want to put in the effort. So I guess my question is, what strategies or supports would you suggest to implement and offer those students?
Yeah, so that's part of what I meant when I said, even if you're trying to do this in a classroom, students are unlearning the 6 or 7 or 8 years before they got to you. But one of the strategies I found to be most helpful is really just making work that is truly meaningful and that has as much of a real world context, or really is real world, as possible. So things like having an audience for their work that's outside of the classroom, like, hey, we're working on our informational writing, and the way that we're going to do that is partnering with the local history museum, and they need us to rewrite their I don't know what it's called, I mean, like the wall explainer things. Is there a term for that? You know what I mean? So like, hey, like they're relying on us to do this. We're going to be showing them our first drafts down at the museum in 2 weeks, and then we're going to revise, right? That type of project immediately, you know, of course you'll always have middle school students who goof off with stuff, but immediately you start to see students take things more seriously because someone other than my teacher and someone other than my classmates are looking at this. And it doesn't always have to be elaborate. Sometimes it's just about publishing work online, or going to read something to the kindergarten class down the hallway, or any of the many ways you can just really make it matter to them.
I'm wondering if you have suggestions for how to begin conversations with people who struggle with these kinds of ideas because, oh, they're going to, even though it isn't an anything goes philosophy, people view it that way because and sometimes they see life as a zero-sum game. If you get this thing, then I have to lose out because of it. And I think those are critical conversations that we need to have with our colleagues and families and community members, and I'm just looking for ways to begin those conversations that don't shut doors immediately.
I think sometimes the same way that we try to meet students where they are, we can also try to meet colleagues where they are, and sort of, this is something else, preview for those of you tomorrow, we're going to talk about this too, but sort of honoring where their resistance is coming from, because like you said, sometimes it comes from a place of fear or scarcity. And we live in a world that is really run on fear and scarcity a lot of the time. And so having people just try to imagine a little bit from more of a place of abundance, right? Like, what if there was enough to go around? And in school, sometimes, you know, part of what we're talking about is, if we're talking about care or acceptance or community, there is enough to go around. And so sometimes I just gently question, sometimes I make an observation or a disconfirming observation. You know, if a colleague says, well, this student's just trying to be really manipulative, maybe I come back to that with a, oh, huh, yeah, it could be. I think that when I work with this student, I experience something different. Can I tell you about what I experienced with this student? And just sort of coming to it from that place of, can I just offer you another perspective? I will say that it's hard, you know, it's hard, right? And because this so connects to a worldview, right? And so I don't know that it's realistic to expect to fully change someone's worldview with a few conversations, but I really find that just coming to them with that gentleness, offering something different, sharing a perspective, and then if you see those moments where they're leaning into that sense of there's not enough for everyone, really just offering like, what if there was enough for everybody? I think we probably have time for 1 or 2 more.
I was just curious because you were mentioning that you had worked in a school that centered around this concept. I was curious with the grading system, if possibly they changed the grading system or what that may have looked like at your school. I'm just curious. I work at a middle school as well, and they're very strict. You know, you need this amount of grades put in by this time. You need certain academics, certain personal management. So just interested in what that might look like.
Yeah, so at that school, every class was just pass-fail, and what the criteria were for passing was usually co-designed with students. So the teacher would usually design the criteria as a base, right? Like, X amount of work or this amount of progress, depending on the student's needs or the group, it would depend a little bit. And then often then run that by the students and talk about what felt realistic, what are your goals in this content area. And again, because it was so small, we really had the luxury to do that. But I will say that, in Vermont, we have from the state level requirement that all schools are using proficiency-based grading and really looking at, marking students on their proficiency of the skill rather than just random grades. There are schools across the country that are doing similar things. So there are some interesting models out there. And then I also have a few friends and colleagues. I do this at the college level, which is a little different, but I have some friends and colleagues at the middle and high school levels that have been able to convince their administration to let them do this ungrading approach where basically they're not grading anything throughout the semester, but then at the end, students are coming up with a grade that they feel they deserve based on, sometimes they'll do a rubric, they'll have gotten feedback on assignments, and so they're kind of doing an alternative grading model, even within a school that mostly uses regular grades. There's a network called Teachers Going Gradeless that you can, if you just Google that phrase, you'll find they have a podcast that actually I'm going to be on in a couple weeks. They have some Twitter resources, they have a website, and so for people interested, it's mostly teachers whose schools do not really support that, but are trying it anyway. All right, anyone want the last one?
All for coming out tonight. Sorry, Gib, I know I'm out of camera. Coming over. Thanks for coming out tonight. Those that are joining us for the workshop tomorrow, it will start at 10 o'clock, so please join us in Zabel by 9:30 because there's some paperwork to fill out. And let's thank Alex for being here. And Alex does have a few questions, or a few minutes to answer questions, sign books, or whatever, if you have brought those, and then we'll let her have some downtime, as it's been a very busy day, and tomorrow's busy again. So thank you all again, and have a great evening. Before we go, though, we do have 2 door prizes, and the winners are Amanda Villagomez and Katie Clark.